Guess why students never talk about capitalism in their economics classes? Because you're not allowed to do that, because you're narrowing down the perspective so that the two pillars are taken for granted. You'll never discuss wage labor and private command over investment in an econ class, because those are just taken as features of this world that are indisputable. You go and look at, you're narrowing the view, and then you're universalizing these conditions in time and in place, right? And this is extremely powerful. And of course, this is what Marx himself denounced as being the basis of ideology, right? You're universalizing specific principles that hold for our specific society, but in doing that, you give a sense of there's no alternative. So even if that's the ideology, I think in reality, these policies show how when the state actually gives something to people and the market dependence is in a way softened, people do react, demanding just an alternative economic system. And that's why austerity is all about de-democratizing the economic space. You cannot allow people to have a greater say, because of course the logic of profit is in contradiction with the logic of need, and people stand up for the logic of need that does not work for our economy. And that's why, you know, you have Mussolini doing it his way, and the book is dedicated, by the way, to my great uncle who committed suicide in prison. He hung himself with the shoelaces because he was tortured by the Nazi fascists for days, and he didn't want to talk against his comrades. So he couldn't do it that way, what we're seeing happening today in a lot of places in the world. Or you can do it the liberal way, which is about independent central banks and, you know, like making sure that the treasury is not liable to political interference and democratic pressure. So you're just de-democratizing the spheres of influence, and making sure that the economists just run those completely with a lack of liability towards democratic processes.
All right, greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Clara Mattei, author of an incredible new book that I just finished reading called The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way for Fascism. Welcome to Emancipations podcast. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's an honor to have you. We really, I mean, I felt like my audience, my community had actually requested that I reach out to you, because your book is sort of creating a lot of waves and creating a lot of important discussions. I mean, we have so many interesting debates about the meaning of fascism in our present moment. And one of the things that obviously since 2008, everyone has kind of talked about, oh yeah, we live in austerity, and it almost feels like austerity is eternal or sort of ever-present or omnipresent, that there's maybe that almost like, yeah, it's a natural way of thinking about capitalism. And so I wanted to start, perhaps if we could, for you to describe the historical basis of what you refer to as the Red Years, and the very interesting way that after the First World War, basically in Europe, the workers' movement had demanded a fundamental restructuring of the capitalist order. In Italy, in Britain, you focus on in particular, but I'm also thinking of like Red Vienna. I do a lot of work in psychoanalytic theory, and there's this, just as a total side point, a very interesting point that Freud, when he started his clinics, they were actually free because of the social welfare of that context and that time. And so there's this like really egalitarian basis of psychoanalysis, but that was the sort of the radical egalitarian social welfare that happened after the war. And in a way, that kind of is the beginning of the story of your book.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes. Absolutely. General methodological point is that historical political economy history can really teach us a lot about current dynamics in a way that is much deeper and more systematic. And the nature and logic of austerity has been completely misunderstood, not just by neoclassical economists who support it, but also by the left, the Keynesian left, that doesn't really see the rationality behind austerity in having to actually tame economic alternatives. So, what you see after the First World War is the emerging of these economic alternatives that needed badly to be quashed in order for our economic system, namely capitalism, to regain strength. Now, it is this approach to historical political economy that I've tried to bring to life through the creation of the center that I now direct, the CHE, Center for Heterodox Economics, which is, again, offering spaces for more critical and courageous knowledge. Maybe we can talk about what we do specifically more after. But what I think is that really academics and intellectuals have a huge responsibility in how they look, not just at the present, but at the past. And what they want to see of the past is usually actually very much determined by how strongly they want to justify the present. Let me explain. Historians have focused very little on the years that you're pointing to. The years that the first part of the book of the Capital Order is all focused on is actually the so-called Red Biennium, 1919, 1920. Years that were extremely explosive because of the potential of coming to life of the slogan of economic democracy intended as self-management, self-governance of workers, and the participation of people, common people, who were the people who had allowed for the war to be won by the Allies in the first place, to actually participate in fundamental decisions regarding material resources and how to distribute them. These moments in history are dangerous to be discussed because they do open up spaces for political imagination also for the present. And it's something that people, the elites don't want to spend a lot of time on. They prefer to focus on the Great Depression, a moment in which workers were already weak because of the success of austerity in the late 1920s and 1930s. So going back to your point, 1919, 1920, years in which within the West, within the globe, like at the time, the advanced West, right, Europe, even in the United States, a lot of alternatives. So this was not just about Eastern Europe. It was not just about revolutionary Russia. It was about actually councils spreading widely. For example, in Italy, with the factory occupation of the summer of 1920, workers took over the majority of the factories throughout the Italian peninsula, running them independently, showing that independent production was possible, and also showing the alliance with the peasants who had occupied land and were running land through assemblies. And so, without any mythology, it is very interesting to go look at the spirit of the time. That's what I did in the book, is actually say, hey, historians are wrong when, with the benefit of hindsight, they're like, oh, all this anyway, like, lasted short, it failed, so why should we care? No, because if you actually take seriously the spirit of the time, you see the potential of these movements, and you really see how even the governments, Giolitti was the head in Italy of the government in Italy, were very explicit to the big capitalist powers in saying, listen, they're just many more than what we can control with our military force. So this is where economic force comes into action with austerity in basically taming and disciplining people in a way that not even governments on their own could do, in a time in which the majority was advocating for a different vision about the economy, in which the worker was understood as central and actually as capable of participating consciously in economic decisions.
Yeah, I mean, you use the phrase that Togliatti invented, I think, which is that the workers created what they called a new order.
Hmm. The
And
new
that's
order.
an interesting juxtaposition to the capital order, right? For which is the title. So you're pitting like labor versus capital, and yeah, frankly, that is the contradiction. Yeah, that is the fundamental contradiction. And I think there is a way in which people might say, well, 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, planted the seed for this empowerment of the working class, and of course, I think that's true. But what it also overlooks is, multiple decades prior to that of socialist and worker agitation, and the way in which the war, um, came at the moment of almost like the height of that, because you really also talk about labor agitation before the war and how it was at a kind of crescendo point, you
Mhm.
know So it's very interesting, right? Because I think that in a certain way, obviously, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, is terrified of the exportation of Bolshevism. Um, can you can you talk a little bit about how 1917 cast a shadow across Europe? Right, we know we have, like, in Germany, the Spartacist uprising, but, like, when you look at the actual percentage of the Ministry of Labor in Britain and Italy, the two countries that you study, the social welfare in Italy from before the war to after is remarkable, just in terms of the services provided
Yeah,
to the working population.
yeah,
So it's a dramatic change. And the state begins to represent workers, education for workers, things like that.
yeah.
So can you elucidate more about what's actually going on here?
Yes, absolutely. So the book starts with a chapter on the political and economic, but ultimately the political and the economic are interlinked, and this is something that again neoclassical economics completely forgets. But the economic and the political shocks that were brought about by the enormous state intervention during the First World War. The state politicized the economy in the sense that it made it very clear how our economic system was not at all spontaneous, natural, and eternal, nor ultimately just and fair. So this is really important, is how it ultimately, to win the war, um, governments had to overstep the traditional boundaries that until that point had been considered immutable. And this happened in a number of ways. The what you're pointing out is, of course, the fact that in order to appease the population, there was also the experimentation of the welfare state. Actually, the welfare state in Europe is the outcome of this requirement from the part of the bureaucracy to try to appease a population that was under enormous pressure to demand a different functioning of the economy. We had workers had achieved a lot of bargaining power to the war by the sheer fact that workers had gone to the trenches, and that there was a lot of demand for work, for labor, because of course production had escalated to meet war needs. So basically there was a lack of supply of workers, which obviously increases the bargaining power of the workers once the reserve army of labor shrinks, right? So in this moment, workers had achieved much more power in demanding higher wages and demanding better rights. And one way to stop this excessive demands from workers was also to provide them with, new benefits, what we know today being the welfare state. But the main way in which the state intervened was actually to repress the workers by, for example, both in Italy and in Britain. Those are the two countries I look at, but again, they are representatives of a wider phenomena. Um, the states intervened to actually impose high rates of exploitation by law. And this is very important. How? Well, basically, limiting the mobility of labor, for example, limiting or like capping wages, or in Italy, even militarizing the workforce, meaning that if you did not show up to work, you would be considered um, um, uh, you would be considered guilty of high treason. So this is what's interesting, is how ultimately, in a moment in which the class relation changes because of the war and the increased empowerment of workers, the capitalist state tries out many strategies. They try out ways to kind of, in Britain, for example, to incorporate unions within the decision-making processes. And this also means giving in and providing some welfare measures. But it also means really making explicit how the wage relation is ultimately politically supported. And this is where the radical fringes of the movement, of the council movement, and in Britain, it was the shop steward movement, especially in Scotland, were saying, we're not only fighting against the capitalist economy, we're fighting against the capitalist state, because the capitalist state has shown how it's ultimately, it is the state that supports the capitalist economy by putting all the burden on the workers. And this is exactly then the idea of actually calling for a new state that could only emerge from a new economic order. And the new order was actually the title of the famous magazine that was written both by workers and intellectuals in Italy, L'Ordine Nuovo, the Italian saying. And it was very successful in proposing the idea that not only workers could show their agency concretely in organizing in factory assemblies, first at the level of the workshop and going up in different, basically, tiers, but it's also about demonstrating how workers knew much more about the economy than the professors in their armchairs, because they were the ones who knew exactly how capitalism operated. So the New Order, the magazine, was also a space to achieve new epistemic awareness of how much people were those who could produce knowledge and not just accept knowledge from above. And of course, this was extremely revolutionary, because we know that knowledge is power, and this is what was being experimented with. By the way, things that were also considered too radical for the unions and even the socialist parties, who had actually accepted the effort of the war, especially in Britain. Right. So again, radicalism, similar to what I think we see now, of course, a different scale, but the point is that people have seen also the limits of traditional organized labor, and how the unions had ultimately also accepted the bourgeois form of economic organization.
There is a very maybe counterintuitive point in this presentation, in the sense that we often think that worker agitation lessens its intensity in conditions of welfare, that like welfare will dissuade the worker from becoming agitated because they are more at ease in their social life and their amenities are taken care of and so on. But you show that, in fact, the opposite is the case.
Yes, I think this is actually something that also helps explain the rationality for austerity, and we'll get to that in a second, I guess, is to say that social resources actually empower people to participate and pressure the state to have more in terms of capacity to actually gain agency. And this is something you see in the Red Biennium very well, especially in chapter 2. I kind of show how, there were different, not everyone was as radical as the L'Ordine Nuovo movement of Gramsci and Togliatti in Italy. Yeah. There were also experiments that were much more top down with the Ministry of Reconstruction in Britain, for example. But how all these very, very sophisticated projects to actually, for example, offer spaces with libraries and communal areas, and even collective child rearing for women for their summer homes for workers. All of these incredibly interesting projects of social emancipation came at the price of people actually radicalizing. And so what you see is that what I think the reality is that revolution does not stem from impoverishment and destitution. Right. Revolution actually stems from when people see that if they participate, they can actually improve their conditions, and they could actually then ask for a complete elimination of the wage relation, which by definition is oppressive. And so this
Yeah.
is what you see, and that's why ultimately my thesis is that that's exactly the point. Austerity serves to discipline us by taking everything we have away from us.
Right. It's very true too. I mean, you think of Marx in the 1844 manuscripts, where many scholars have said he's really kind of arguing that capitalism immiserates the worker, turns the worker effectively into like an animal, and this condition, though, makes the worker ripe for revolution, right? And I have the feeling, or I have the sense that I'm not sure if that's actually so true.
Yeah.
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 I think actually we need to think very carefully. And that's actually a philosophical question, because it's not just an economic question. It's about the subjectivity of the worker, And I think that's a nice thing about your book. You're not just talking about like technocrats and economists in some sort of subtracted rational space of management, but we're talking about actually this configuration of how political economy primes the working class for passivity or for something more collective solidarity and revolutionary. So that immediately is a very huge, I think, contribution. Now, let us now introduce economists, the great devils, to the picture here. First off, I mean, you say there's kind of like this moment of reformism where like heterodox economic thinking is possible. I mean, probably because the economists, I assume, would have to adapt to the demands of what's happening of the workers after the war. And so they kind of break from, I think, some conventional thinking. Maybe they're not Marxist, but maybe at the same time, you could help explain like what is technocracy? Like, because you have this idea that one of the catalysts of the introduction of austerity is a kind of technocratic class. Do you understand it as a class? That's one question. And two, sort of what power is bequeathed or given to the economist to wield this force onto social life and economic life? It's very profound, because really what you show is that, I mean, the basic story is that by about the early 1920s, the bourgeois, the ruling class, basically uses economists to introduce austerity. Where does that all come about? And can you give us a sort of framework of analysis of sort of what is technocracy? Is this an example of that? And how does that work for you?
Yes. So I look critically. I'm an economist. I have a PhD in economics, and my whole research interest has been about situating the role of economists in constructing the current status quo and protecting it, both materially through economic policies that, again, disenfranchise workers, but also ideologically through theories that then ultimately circulate at all levels and really convince us that if we are poor and marginalized, it's because we deserve it, right? So these ideas that are extremely classist actually stem from economic models that were developed not by chance in a moment in which the ruling ideology was being challenged. So this is very interesting to note how neoclassical economics at the time labeled pure economics, and we'll get back to this because it touches on the point of technocracy. Neoclassical economics, that today is the only one students really have a chance of studying at school, that completely portrays a world that does not exist. I was just on a panel on tariffs the other day with a couple of colleagues, and the world they were depicting was a globalization that was made of cooperation and comparative advantage. And so the disconnect of the abstraction really hides what capitalism is all about, right? You cannot even discuss capitalism. So this myopia in terms of what you see and how you explain it is politically is actually imbued with political effects, right? Actually, how theory is political because it actually hides what is happening and thus creates disempowerment and passive acceptance from the part of everybody else. So this theory was created in a moment in which workers were standing up, demanding a different economic system. The story we have from Economists is that workers do not count. The person who counts is the saver investor, who really ultimately is capable of abstaining, and this virtue allows him to hire the workers, and so workers should just be thankful that someone is hiring them. So you go from the labor theory of value that tells you that actually value is the outcome of unpaid labor and ultimately of theft, and that capital is the result of exploitation, to a theory that tells you profits are just the fair remuneration of the investment of capital that comes from individuals' capacity to save. And of course, workers can't save by definition, but this is because they are ultimately deficient in qualities. And I have plenty of quotes in which these economists are really, really explicitly saying the bourgeoisie embodies the homo economicus, while the working classes are just in that state because of their acting like pigs and wasting all the resources they have. Really, the workers squander while the homo economicus is capable of support. Sorry, I just want to read you this quote. I'm going to get back to technocracy because it's directly connected, but I just want to give you a sense of the words. And what's interesting is that if you look at history, what you see is that they make much more explicit what now is hidden by numbers. So now we see a lot of mathematics that hides the classist assumptions. But if you look at the founding fathers of the discipline, they are much more explicit about where their, let's say, politics lies. So that I'll find it. Give me just a second here. All considered, it seems obvious that the classes with lower income are significantly deficient in qualities with respect to others, so that this deficiency is the cause of the lower income and not the lower income the cause of the deficiency. The businessman is thrifty, a thinker, and a calculator is the real man who most resembles the abstract man pictured by economists, who does not fuss like a sissy of a hardship to come. Okay, so this classist view that eliminates workers' agency, eliminates conflict between classes, only sees harmony between individuals and the entrepreneur as central, is supported by an epistemic conviction of superiority that is the foundation of technocracy. The idea that economics is not at all a political science, not by chance it goes from being called political economy to being called pure economics, exactly to stress the fact that we are in a position of superiority because of our apolitical knowledge, and knowledge that is only reflecting in a very positive sense the truth about this world, and that only economists are able to achieve the knowledge about this truth. So really a Platonic understanding of the economist as being able to really look at the world of ideas, and then has the responsibility to come back down in the cave and teach everyone else. And if people don't want to be taught, they're going to get tamed with austerity policies that will force them into the proper behavior. So this is really where technocracy ultimately is the best ally of austerity, because it justifies very harsh measures as being founded upon pure, objective, neutral principles that, of course, then match any hard science, right? So there's plenty of quotes about economists trying to say economics is just like chemistry or biology or physics, and people should accept that we need to make decisions for them.
Wow. It's very fascinating because the rationality of the hierarchy of the order you call classist, but in some sense it's the opposite of classist because it disavows class struggle. But I see what you mean by classist. You
Yes.
mean by classist is in the disavowal of class conflict, there's an affirmation that there's a kind of unipolar class, or that, well, ultimately, I guess, where they want a world in which the legibility of class conflict is not permitted to like function anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, the disavowal of class conflict is what allows for the ruling ideology to achieve a sense of impartiality, and the idea that actually there is such thing as the good of the whole under a capitalist society, right? So it's the denial that capitalism is actually an oppressive system based on exploitation, is the idea that actually we can all thrive. And this is exactly what neoclassical economics tells you today. Ultimately, through the markets, we all achieve the optimality. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that the denial of class analysis is the most powerful political tool of all. And because it entrenches the acceptance for our economic system in a way that is extremely powerful, in basically having everyone accept this incredible hierarchies that we see today, by which billionaires are accumulating 5.7 billion a day, while more than half of American families can't even make their ends meet. So this is considered, the natural state of things, given these eternal hierarchies. Now, last thing I want to point out, what's interesting though, is that what I do methodologically is, okay, take their pure economics textbooks that deny classes and only talk about individuals, with what they're writing in the newspapers. And what you see, similarly to now, if you take a Larry Summers, what he writes in his theory, and then when he says to the Fed, the class struggle emerges obviously, right? What they're saying is that they hate the workers. They have very strong lines about how workers have, like, achieved rights they do not deserve, and they live like pigs in the tavern and these are the actual words that you can find in my book, taken from them. So when you see them in the policy public space, they say things that are clearly oppressive, right? Larry Summers now would tell us, yeah, you can't have higher unemployment this because then you got inflation. Which, what does it mean? Well, people need to suffer in order for there to be monetary stability, right? So it's in their policy making that the classist nature of their role in society emerges very explicitly. And how they say it, and in what they're proposing, which is, again, that workers have to consume less, produce more, which is ultimately the motto of austerity. So in a way, their impartiality collapses once you look at them as historical people doing their policy advice, which is actually what technocrats are supposed to do, is then, of course, advise governments. And not by accident, these pure economists were advising Mussolini's government, Benito Mussolini, the founding father of Western fascism in 1922.
And these technocratic economists are technically political ideology-wise, they are liberals. Yeah. Is that correct?
Some. So in the British case that I discussed, yes. In the Italian case, some are explicitly fascist,
Okay.
and others are liberals. But this is I think the interesting point is to say, hey, if you focus on their economic policies, then there's really very little difference between the fascists and the liberals, because they're all supporting austerity to screw over their workers and maintain capital investment.
Wow. Yeah, that's very heavy duty. So perhaps it's a good time, Clara, for you to introduce sort of the nuts and bolts of austerity. One of the things I like about your introduction of austerity is that you talk about the industrial, monetary, fiscal, and so on. Because I mean, I think after Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, austerity is, like I said before, so ubiquitous. Like this crazy ideology that like the family is like the budget of the family is a metaphor for the budget of the state, and so we need to have like a like this sense that the strength of the individual and their grit and their determination and all of that, and how that feeds into, even I would say, like the American bootstrap mythology and algerism and all of those ideological forms that we're very familiar with. But what you're talking about here is you talk about the invention of austerity. So one question I had is, what do you mean by like invention of austerity? Because in a certain way, couldn't you also say really that austerity was a sort of principle of capitalist bourgeois rule all throughout the 19th century, from like, early industrial revolution
Yes.
up, like, right. So what is unique about the 1920s invention of these technocratic economists?
Thank you. This is, I think, important. Is There's a lot to say here. So, first of all, what you discover by looking at history is that austerity is not the state stepping back. It's actually the state forcefully intervening to protect the capital order. And when I use the term capital order, I again want to stress how capital is not spontaneous, is based on a social relation, right? Capital is not actually coming from this virtues of the saver investors, as the pure economics will tell us, but it's actually the outcome of a social relation of exploitation. So, right, the majority has to go to work for a wage, has no other alternatives, and thus produces this extra value that then is capital as we know it. So the capital order requires constant protection. So the idea that there is a divide between the market and the state, and that it's all about more market or more state, is is already a very ideological dichotomy that does not stand historically. Because what you see is that austerity reforms are all about the state stepping in to take away resources from the majority of the working people and channel these resources to the saving investing elite through subsidies, de-risking, and ultimately all the economic incentives that allow for private command over investment to maintain itself. So the two pillars of capitalism, wage labor and private command over investment, have to be constantly protected. They're not going to stand on their own. They've never stood on their own. They've always been the outcome of, from the very primitive accumulation that we know, have always been politically encased, right? So this is the whole idea of the Trinity. And then I'll go back to your point about, wasn't there austerity also before? But let me just define it first. So the austerity trinity is a way to kind of conceptualize what I saw in the archives, in the voices and writings of these actors that were operating starting from the 1920s, for example, at the Brussels and Genoa conferences, these first international financial conferences that, guess what, did not call representatives of labor. They said, no, we are scientific. We're not going to call representatives of labor. We're going to call the professors, the advisors, who are, of course, neutral and thus trustworthy. And what you see is that this code of austerity that we still see today, and I would say, yes, was also around in the past, I'll qualify that in a moment, is made crystal clear and then is applied through different means in different countries. And my book focuses on the parallel between Britain and Italy, again, because I think it shows very striking parallelism between a liberal economy and a fascist one. So what we see is that fiscal austerity is not about, and this is where, again, the definitions we use today are wrong, and they're wrong because they hide what really matters. So austerity is not about budget cuts and tax increases. This definition tells you absolutely nothing. It actually gives you a sense, again, of kind of the state fixing the budgetary problem. Now, what's happening here is not budget cuts in toto, it's cuts in social expenditures, cuts in the welfare state that was just born, by the way, at that point, right? So an incredible 180-degree rotation from what was just happening a couple of years before. And so cuts in unemployment, cuts in housing, cuts in education. The Geddes Acts in Britain of 1922 was much bigger than the cuts even someone like Margaret Thatcher was able to do in the 80s, right? So, and again, very much forgotten.
Wow.
Acts in yes, in 1922. I have all the data.
You mean at scale, like
Yeah,
the
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
wow.
In terms of also percentage of GDP and in real terms, absolutely. So then, what you see here is that this money is being taken away from workers, and again, this is not stupid according to the logic of the system, because it increases the market dependence, which is exactly the economic compulsion that forces people to go and work for a wage because they need to secure survival. And once you take away the resources, you become more market dependent, and this is good for our economic system. Of course, not good for people, but good for the economic system. And then the money is channeled to the private savers, investors who are constantly protected, and we see this today, obviously, with the asset managers being completely funded and protected by the state, by the military industrial complex. I mean, the genocide in Gaza, and horrendous. We know it's 2 months of complete siege. There's no food entering, and there's hundreds of people dying every day with no functioning hospital because they've been completely cut down. We know there's no life anymore in Gaza. There's now, the recent statistic is 65,000 children are acutely malnourished, and this is, of course, a gross undercount. So all of this, the extreme violence that we're seeing today, is not separable from austerity capitalism. Why? Well, because ultimately austerity capitalism is about channeling resources to the private sector, and the best sector to invest in is indeed the military sector. Why? Because it doesn't empower workers. It does not diminish the market dependence like social welfare would do, and in the same time, it actually keeps demand for these commodities very, very high. So this is how the governments are stimulating the economy right now. Militarism is completely compatible with the logic of austerity. Austerity is also about regressive taxation, not just increases in taxes. It's about the fact that you're taxing labor more than capital. And what you see at the time is that they're bragging about having found more workers to tax, more people to tax. And this is Benito Mussolini has great lines of saying, I finally found a whole army of people we can tax. In the meantime, they're eliminating inheritance taxes. They're taking away the super profit taxes that had been implemented right after the war. And they're fundamentally, again, what we see now in the United States, in which, of course, if your earnings come from capital, you are fundamentally tax-free, right? The level of regressivity has only increased over time. But that was a good experiment. So that's fiscal austerity, regressive taxation, and elimination of the social services in favor of channeling money. And again, this is not cheap. Fiscal austerity is actually quite expensive. That's why it never really serves the purpose it's supposed to, which is to balance the budget. Actually, usually the debt gets worse. But again, this is not bad for capitalism because it entrenches further market dependence. Then we have monetary austerity, which is what we've seen. It was experimented very strongly in Britain in 1921. And what we've seen today, if you increase interest rates, again, this is not a matter of technical monetary policies to solve inflation. What you're really solving is increasing the rate of exploitation, right? So you don't target, you say you target inflation, what you're targeting is the rate of exploitation, because ultimately increases in interest rates have an impact on the labor market. There's more unemployment, which means you can actually discipline workers and cut wages. And this is actually statistically, you can see all these statistics in the 1920s matching perfectly, again, what's happened in the last few years also in the United States, is that once interest rates go up, unionization rates start declining in Britain, strikes start dropping, and guess what? Wages drop too. And you have completely eliminated all the demands for economic democracy and industrial self-management. So G.D.H. Cole actually has a really nice line. He was a guild socialist at the time. He says, he makes clear that there's short-term losses. Of course, maybe profits go down a little bit, but ultimately there's a much longer term gain, which is that you save the system from collapse, right? And that's the whole point. And then finally, industrial austerity. I called it like that just because it gets a sense that the state is directly intervening. It's not, fiscal and monetary austerity operate on the labor market, but indirectly, right? It increases market dependence, it increases unemployment. It's more of an indirect way of operating on the labor market. Industrial austerity is very direct. It's about attacking unions. Mussolini was the best one at doing this because he outlawed unions and abolished the possibility of striking. And then it's about what we saw, heavily deregulating the labor market, taking away all rights that workers have gained, and of course, huge privatizations that again support the private investors and increase market dependence. So this trinity I show operates together. And the elements actually reinforce one another, and that's what you see. And again, though, that austerity is then backed by all these all these ideas that clearly suggest that this is the natural operation of things, because you're ultimately shifting the money to those who really count to run the economy. So this is only the right way to do it. Now, closing. You say, was this around before? Yes. My thesis personally out of this book, and now with what I've been looking at, is that austerity is in the DNA of capitalism. I would say there would be no capitalism without austerity. Austerity is, again, the active intervention to safeguard these pillars. And can you have capitalism without austerity? I would suspect not. And that's why I'm now looking at the golden age, right? The supposed Keynesian period, to say, hey, look, there was a lot of austerity also there. And that's why ultimately militarism prevailed as the way to boost the economy, starting from the Korean War all the way to Vietnam and so forth. So to your point, I would say austerity was around also in the 19th century. It was around since the birth of capitalism. It actually is part of the birth of it, because ultimately primitive accumulation was all about privatizing the commons and enforcing wage labor. But I would say that what's different is that it becomes more explicit in a moment in which it is about reacting against alternatives. So why it's interesting to look at the 1920s is just because what is happening now and what was happening in the 19th century is more obviously stated as a reaction to protect the system in a moment in which these alternatives are so strong. So it denaturalizes austerity. Austerity was kind of part of the package of the gold standard and the natural operation of things in the 1900s. It becomes explicitly a political project that has to be fine-tuned with technocracy and kind of pure economics in the years I look at. But this doesn't mean that you couldn't look at other periods and find very similar things.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I mean, I'm thinking of the Second Reich under Bismarck. They had this thing called the social question, and he had the anti-socialist laws, right? And so there was all kinds of disciplining of workers, and even imperialism was about, in some cases, disciplining of workers to send them off to fight. And so there's very interesting follow-up research that your book really opens up. But I mean, I think, again, for readers that are not specialists in this material, you're presenting some kind of counterintuitive insights here. We've already addressed a few of them. Now I want to get to the fascism question. One of the things, Clara, that a lot of people that debate fascism, and like in today's time, one of the kind of formulas that people often repeat is that, you can't really use fascism in a dignified or true sense, in a real way, as a valid way to describe the ideology of today's right wing, unless you have the conditions of a vibrant workers' movement. You've heard this argument, I think, right? How do you parse that point, right? Because in a certain way, you're not making a claim that is like, oh, these technocrats that introduced austerity were themselves fascist. No, actually, a slim group of them were ideologically aligned with fascism. But what I understand your argument to be is that fascism was the natural result of this removal of social welfare provisions on a mass scale, and the attendant or consequence of radical depoliticization amongst the working class and the precaritization amongst the working class that maybe kind of planted the seeds for fascism. So where does fascism really enter the picture here in your narrative, in your account?
So I think there's been too little attention to the economic foundations of fascism. So, again, as always, the economic policies, not by chance, take a secondary role in our understanding of the world. And again, this is because it is really the best ideological tool. Let's keep away what really matters, kind of thing. So, I would say to your question that fascism as it operated in Italy was different in ways from Nazism, for example, in the 1930s. So fascism in Italy clearly came into power because of its capacity to tell the liberal elite, we will do the job for you. I, the strong man, I'm capable of crushing working class demands, and I'm the best student of austerity. And this is what you see in the Italian case, is that by bringing the economist into cabinet, also liberal economist, and by basically applying the austerity trinity in a very efficient way, Mussolini gains the political support he needs in order to actually institute a full-blown regime that then lasts over 20 years. So the fact that he is crushing strikes and making unions legal and torturing is seen as, the only way out to resolve the revolutionary crisis in Italy. And I'll just read you a letter that I found at the British Archives that for me was like, okay, this is exactly what emblematic of how the liberal elite is thinking. This is from Montagu Norman. Montagu Norman was the governor of the Bank of England. He was in power for many years, and he was considered, the emblem of the British technocrat. Let me find the quote. So here he is. So even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, quote, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated, and, quote, opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, quote, the state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued. Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. So this he writes to actually Jack Morgan Jr. of the House of Morgan, currently Chase Bank, very supportive of Mussolini and key in providing Mussolini the loans the Italy needed after the war. So this is the Italian story, right? Again, and that's why you see the strong alliance with the British elite, and why you see how what happened in Britain in terms of austerity tactics was parallel to what was happening in Italy, and has us, think about all of the times this happens over and over in the history of capitalism, from Pinochet to Suharto in Indonesia to Boris Yeltsin in Russia, in which Larry Summers just says, you know what, of course, he's bombing his own parliament, but what we care about is that he's bringing about the reforms of privatization, liberalization, and ultimately opening the market to Western corporations. So this you see all the time. Now, the case of Germany is slightly different, and I think follows more what you were suggesting, which is after at least 10 good years of austerity imposed on Germany by the way, the international regime and the League of Nations. By 32, the German population was impoverished, was upset, and was segmented. And this is exactly what austerity is good at. Austerity is successful exactly at killing class awareness and in making us feel impotent through austerity, right? This is what austerity should do. That's how you preserve capitalism. So then the results of this is, of course, that you buy into what we see today, which is the idea that this strong man will solve our problems by hating the Jews or hating the immigrants. So the story in Britain for Hitler's Germany is more, okay, austerity functioned in getting people disillusioned with the system, yet powerless. So actually eliminating all of the positive energy towards change. And what you see here is ultimately Hitler coming to power and though applying the austerity textbook over again. So if you read Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze, what you see is ultimately, said in my wording, for me, that's austerity, in the sense that you see the attack on workers, organized labor, the suppression of wages, and militarization.
Yeah.
And then again, militarization, similar to what, by the way, is happening in Germany today, in which Europe is dismantling the welfare state in favor of militarization. And this is really what's scary, is that, of course, the militarization, as Tooze explains in that book, means that you'll ultimately use these weapons, as we were seeing with the perpetuation of the war in Ukraine and, of course, the genocide in Gaza. So again, the Second World War cannot be explained without the economic foundations of the pressures that the austerity logic brings about, which is, okay, now we're in this. Now we have a crisis of overproduction in the military. We have to keep going so that our economy is stimulating according to the logic of capital without empowering the workers.
It seems to me that a big result of your research should be a profound politicization on behalf of economists, even Keynesians, because you show that Keynesianism itself requires austerity as well.
Yes.
It does not adequately challenge this, because everything you're saying is really intense. I mean, frankly, to see that liberal economists have this power, like maybe you could say it should inspire young economists to go into the field of economics precisely because they have this power to challenge, to shake it up, right? It's profound, it's significant, and I wanted to make a slight pivot, if we could, to maybe the post 2008 milieu and our own present with austerity. And I think you used the phrase of like the eternality of austerity, and it does feel that way. I mean, maybe the fact that austerity has squashed the working class consciousness so much, even Bernie Sanders and AOC doing the oligarchy tour, it gives us hope. It gives us like something to hold on to. But this idea that the system could at all go in a different direction, right? This idea of Tina, of there is no alternative. Ever since I was born in the early 1980s, I've lived with Tina, and I think my whole generation has. But that hasn't prevented us from being politicized. That hasn't killed our spirit. We still will fight. We still will look at history. We will look at the workers' movement of the past and get inspiration from it. So is it, what's your assessment now? Because I love the point you make also about how after COVID, you said the CARES Act gave $790 billion to the business sector. But then what was it that individuals received? I don't know what it was, 20 some odd % of people that got payments. I mean, it was like a third of that, if not less, right? You probably have the numbers. So there is this sense in which orthodox economic thought just simply is so entrenched, neoliberal, Keynesian, you name it. So how do you sort of penetrate, and obviously you have heterodox economic thinking, of course, and you have Marxist thinking, but like how do we sort of start to think of formulas of political economy beyond austerity? Can you say some general things about this for us?
Yes, there's a lot there. First of all, I think the example you bring, interestingly enough, even if the COVID measures were in line with the logic of austerity in the sense that check out who got the biggest portion of the of public money, and it's the usual suspects, still the very little resources people got, even just higher unemployment benefits or a check in their mail, was enough to ultimately propel a lot of workers raising up, either through new unions and a lot of wins. We don't want to forget how big the wins were just a couple of years ago, and 50 million workers in 2022 spontaneously leaving their jobs, which is 30% of the workforce. That's
the great resignation.
Exactly. That's huge, right? So again, I think it shows that how much austerity convinces us that there's no alternative, because that's ultimately the theory behind justifying austerity is all about, that capitalism is natural and invincible. And again, what happens here is that you're narrowing the perspective. Guess why students never talk about capitalism in their economics classes? Because you're not allowed to do that, because you're narrowing down the perspective so that the two pillars are taken for granted. You'll never discuss wage labor and private command over investment in an econ class, because those are just taken as features of this world that are indisputable. You go and look at, you're narrowing the view, and then you're universalizing these conditions in time and in place, right? And this is extremely powerful. And of course, this is what Marx himself denounced as being the basis of ideology, right? You're universalizing specific principles that hold for our specific society, but in doing that, you give a sense of there's no alternative. So even if that's the ideology, I think in reality, these policies show how when the state actually gives something to people and the market dependence is in a way softened, people do react, demanding just an alternative economic system. And that's why austerity is all about de-democratizing the economic space. You cannot allow people to have a greater say, because of course the logic of profit is in contradiction with the logic of need, and people stand up for the logic of need that does not work for our economy. And that's why, you have Mussolini doing it his way, and the book is dedicated, by the way, to my great uncle who committed suicide in prison. He hung himself with the shoelaces because he was tortured by the Nazi fascists for days, and he didn't want to talk against his comrades. So he couldn't do it that way, what we're seeing happening today in a lot of places in the world. Or you can do it the liberal way, which is about independent central banks and, like making sure that the treasury is not liable to political interference and democratic pressure. So you're just de-democratizing the spheres of influence, and making sure that the economists just run those completely with a lack of liability towards democratic processes, right? So all of this to say that the system is not at all stable. Again, the system needs a lot of effort to support it. And that's why I hope the book is actually not depressing, is to say, hey, if you actually focus on the strategies to maintain the system in place, you realize how big the effort is and how scared the elite are about any possibilities of changing in the status quo. And that's, I think, what's empowering, is to say, if austerity is not about the state stepping back, but it's about the state stepping in, and it's about actually a political project that has nothing to do with technical issues, then we realize that common people can speak up and understand the economic system because they live the economic contradictions under our skin. So what we're doing here at CHE, Center for Heterodox Economics, is actually an experiment with all the difficulties of starting a new institution. Is an experiment in which, I hope we provide, as you were pointing out, a space for students to want to question the economic dogma, and that unfortunately it's very hard to do if you're presented with a textbook that just says, hey, learn these principles and apply them through math, and that's your econ. That, but also at the same time, we are providing spaces for genuine dialogue for citizens in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of course. It's a city that in itself represents all of the contradictions. There's huge amounts of poverty, segregation, marginalization. People are feeling it, but people are also active and thirsty towards systemic structural critique. And I've been surprised by the amount of interest. We had more than 100 people in our first two public events, not counting 240 at our inaugural conference, but that there were academics there too. But these other events have only been about really just people who saw the flyers I've been posting all through town and kind of trying to get this outreach. And these people are not just like there to listen, they're there also to because they've been doing stuff that is against the current. There's plenty of interesting solidarity economy experiments happening in Tulsa, as happening in a lot of other places. They just don't have the space to express the fact that they exist, but they do exist. The alternatives are always there. The point is how to get these alternatives together and strengthen the sense of real social change. And what the CHE can provide is, okay, the educational aspect, right? If people do feel stronger, if they can think in a way that is more imaginative and deeper. And so that's what we're trying to do here. But again, I think this should be done everywhere. I mean, any economist or academic right now who is intellectually honest understands that, writing a book and becoming famous does nothing for the system. It just, just play into it. Yeah, sure, you start getting more out of honoraria and nice trips for vacations here and there. But if you do want to do something, you got to start creating institutions that can influence how things are done. Again, not top down, but with the idea that we can offer spaces and energy as a university, as an institution connected to university, for people to build on the knowledge they can get. And that's kind of the idea. And going back to your point, absolutely. I think there's a lot of space, and we are in a moment in which people are fed up. We've tried the Trump option. Clearly, people, he's very low actually approval right now. So I guess the question is, if this right wing keeps doing austerity, is there a moment in which the base will actually break, not just from the Democratic Party, but also from the Republican party? What's offered there? And that's why the left is guilty. The left is not offering anything right now. So I think we need to go back to the local and the energy that is on the ground.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, it is striking that 200,000 bureaucrats have been removed with Doge and Trump. That's a lot. That's unprecedented, and kind of connects to your point that you made earlier about what a technocrat is, and the fact that technocratic policies are almost like the handmaiden of reactionary politics, even though they're the most educated, often Ivy League, often very professional, etc., etc. So you show a certain complicity, the dark side of technocratic rule. And I mean, people are not protesting these firings, which I think is a sign that whether rightly or wrongly, people do associate the misery of social life to these technocrats, to these bureaucrats. And that itself should be incentive for that class, the professional managerial class, whatever you want to call them, to wake up. Yeah. If I could ask you one final question, if that's okay. How does your book maybe change the debates that we have about fascism in our present? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Again, I think it changes the debate because it tries to say, let's be clear that fascism is not the exception to the norm, but it's actually the acceleration of the norm. And I think this is important, is to say, once you focus again on the economic policies that fascism expresses, you see how they're very much in line with, again, the technocrat liberal understanding of what our economic order should be. So I think that's the first thing, is to say, we are tend in our way we grow up at school is to say, oh, fascism is this thing, it's like a qualitatively distinct state of the world. Actually, fascism is just the management of capitalism on steroids. It's like actually the best management for capitalist economies in moments of social disintegration or social struggle. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is just like, let's understand again that the problem is not Trump and whatever, if you want to call Trump fascist, that's a different debate, but that's not the problem. Is not that's just a symptom of a deeper cause, which is our capitalist economy. So a capitalist economy will ultimately lead to barbarism in the form of fascism, as ultimately Rosa Luxemburg points out, right? So this barbarism takes the form of these deeply, deeply violent political organizations that, again, are best expressed by the Netanyahu government right now and by the United States, that's completely just supporting the annihilation of 2 million people, the majority of whom are children. I don't think there is a level of this brutality, you know. So if fascism is also about just like political brutality, well, we're seeing it right now. But again, this is part of the long history of our economic system from its very beginning. It's just a very, very obvious and even harsher expression of it. So maybe that would be my insight for now.
It's very good. It's very good. Thank you, Clara, for coming on the show and giving us all of this. So much to think about. And I guess as a slight encore question, do you find in economics departments today, how is Marx thought of? How is,
Well, I
or is
don't
he not
count
thought of?
because I've been teaching before moving here at the University of Tulsa. I've been teaching for almost 10 years as an associate professor at the economics department at the New School.
Oh,
So
okay.
we kind of, you know,
They're more favorable.
we kind of teach Marx and take
Yeah.
Marx seriously as an
Yeah.
economist. I would say in any other school, Marx is never even mentioned or like taught. So, you know, he's not even considered an economist. But again, with this idea that anyone who does historical social analysis is not an economist by definition, which is the real problem. Here, we are trying to, in our minor in heterodox economics and the study of capitalism, of course, we will be teaching that. But again, we need more spaces for students because the students are incredibly, incredibly receptive.
Yeah.
So yeah, and last thing I would like to say is that you can follow our events. We'll have one on the racial wealth gap on May 16th. We have a YouTube channel. It's Che at Tulsa. You can find it easily.
I'll link to it. Yeah.
And anyone, if one wants to get involved, please reach out to me. I'm only happy to help.
Maybe you guys can start a podcast.
I mean, that we're trying, exactly. But the resources are, you know, the usual problem. But I would like to learn from you, actually. I would love to have that conversation.
Happy to chat with you about it. No,
Awesome.
I'm a huge fan of your work, and I wish you all the success
Thank you. Thank
that
you, Daniel, for
you
having
deserve.
me. Thank you.
It's a real great honor to have you. Thanks so much.
Have a wonderful day.